S.C.Gwynne's Empire of the Summer Moon is both a sweeping history and an intimate portrait of the clash between the Comanche people and the white settlers who poured into their lands in the 19th century. It is a story of violence and endurance, of cultural collision on a vast frontier, and of one extraordinary man, Quanah, who rose from the devastation of his people to become their last great chief. At its heart, the book tells of the rise and fall of the Comanches, a tribe so powerful and feared that for a long stretch of history they effectively halted westward expansion across a huge swath of North America. But it is also the story of one white woman, Cynthia and Parker, captured as a child and assimilated fully into Comanche life, and of her son Quanah, whose life bridged the world of the horse-raiding warriors and the new world of reservation life under the United States. The Comanches were not always the dominant force of the Great Plains. They began as part of the Shoshone people, originally mountain dwellers in the Rockies, but sometime in the early 18th century they acquired horses, likely from Spanish settlers and traders in New Mexico. The horse transformed them utterly. The Comanches took to mounted life like no other people, becoming perhaps the greatest horsemen in human history. They were able to fight, hunt, and travel in ways unimaginable without horses. They migrated south and east onto the Llano Estacado, the vast high plains of what would become Texas, Oklahoma, and parts of New Mexico. There they carved out an empire. With speed and mobility, they pushed aside or destroyed other tribes. The Apaches were driven away, the Tonkawas reduced, the Wichitas subordinated. By the late 1700s and into the 1800s, the Comanches were the undisputed masters of the southern plains, their power radiating from their endless herds of horses and their ferocious skill in war. They built a culture around the horse and the buffalo. The buffalo gave them food, clothing, shelter, and tools. The horse gave them military dominance. Comanche warriors could fire arrows with lethal accuracy while riding at full gallop, often loosing 6 or more arrows in the time it took a white soldier to reload a musket. They could cling to the side of their horse, using the animal's body as a shield, then swing up and shoot or hurl a spear. Their mobility allowed them to raid hundreds of miles away and disappear before a pursuing army could respond. They were predators in the truest sense, striking Mexican villages to the south, Texan settlements to the east, and rival tribes across the plains. Their raids brought them captives, horses, weapons, and goods. Their dominance was so complete that the Spanish in Mexico, and later the independent Mexican government, paid tribute to them in the form of gifts and trade in hopes of avoiding destruction. Into this world came the Anglo settlers of Texas. In the 1820s and 1830s, Americans moved into Mexican Texas, and by the time Texas won its independence in 1836, the Comanches saw a new and troubling influx of white intruders into their hunting grounds. The clash was brutal. Settlers carved farms and towns along the frontier, while Comanche raiding parties descended with terrifying speed. Entire families were killed, women raped, children kidnapped. To whites, these raids seemed acts of savage cruelty. To the Comanches, they were part of the natural order of warfare and survival. Captives were valuable. Women could be incorporated into the tribe, children raised as Comanche, men sometimes enslaved or killed. Among those taken was a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia and Parker. In 1836, a Comanche raid on Fort Parker in East Texas left several settlers dead and Cynthia and carried off. She became the most famous white captive in Texas history. Over time, she ceased to be white at all. She was adopted into the tribe, given a new name, raised as Comanche. She married a Comanche warrior, Peter Nakona, and bore 3 children, among them a boy named Quanah. Cynthia and never returned willingly to white society. She tried to escape back to her Comanche family when later rescued by Texas Rangers. Her life became a symbol for Texans of the horror of Indian captivity, but her real story showed how thoroughly the Comanches could absorb outsiders into their world. While settlers and Comanches fought, governments tried and failed to control the frontier. The Republic of Texas launched campaigns against the Comanches, but with limited success. Even the famed Texas Rangers, who eventually became celebrated Indian fighters, at first struggled against the Comanches' mobility and skill. The United States Army, after annexation in 1845, fared little better. The vastness of the plains, the speed of the Comanches, and the primitive state of military logistics meant campaigns were often futile. Soldiers marched in heavy wool uniforms, carrying slow-loading rifles, chasing mounted warriors who could melt away across hundreds of miles. The mid-19th century became the high tide of Comanche power. From roughly 1750 to 1850, they were the dominant military force in the region, even shaping the geopolitics of North America. Their raids into northern Mexico in the 1840s devastated entire provinces, depopulating huge areas and crippling the Mexican economy. Gwynne makes clear that the Comanches were not just a tribal nuisance. They were a regional empire, feared by Mexico, Texas, and other tribes alike. Their economy depended on raiding and trading. Horses taken in Mexico might be sold to traders in New Mexico, who in turn supplied guns and ammunition. Buffalo robes were sold in vast quantities to whites, exchanged for firearms and goods. It was a violent but sophisticated system. Yet the very elements that made the Comanches so powerful contained the seeds of their downfall. They depended utterly on the buffalo, and the great herds were beginning to dwindle as commercial hunters, settlers, and railroads expanded. They relied on horses, but white soldiers gradually adopted better weapons, including the 6-shot Colt revolver and, later, repeating rifles that could match or exceed the Comanche bow. Most devastatingly, they could not withstand the sheer tide of settlers moving westward, backed by an industrializing nation with seemingly limitless resources. The turning point came in the decades after the Civil War. The U.S. Army, now larger and more determined, launched sustained campaigns to clear the plains for settlement. Generals like William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan recognized that to defeat the Comanches, one had to destroy their base of life, the buffalo and the ability to move freely. Sheridan even encouraged buffalo hunters, arguing that killing the herds would end the Indian problem faster than soldiers could. Hunters slaughtered millions of animals, leaving carcasses to rot. By the early 1870s, the great herds of the southern plains were gone, and with them the Comanches' way of life. But the Comanches did not go down without a fight. In 1874, they launched their last great resistance, known as the Red River War. Quanah Parker had by then emerged as a leader of the Quahoddy Band, a fiercely independent group that had long resisted treaties and reservations. The Quahoddy refused to be confined to Indian territory in Oklahoma, instead continuing to hunt and raid from their base in the Texas Panhandle. Quanah, tall, charismatic, and fearless in battle, led raids that kept settlers in terror. He was not a hereditary chief, but rose through merit and charisma. His mixed heritage, white mother, Comanche father, did not weaken him in Comanche eyes. He was judged by his skill, and by all accounts he was a formidable warrior. The Red River War was the U.S. Army's concentrated attempt to end Comanche resistance once and for all. Soldiers pursued Quanah's band across the Staked Plains, using new tactics and better weapons. The decisive battle came at Palo Duro Canyon, where U.S. forces destroyed the Comanche encampment, burning lodges, capturing supplies, and, most devastatingly, killing over 1,000 of their horses. For the Comanches, losing their horses was catastrophic. Without them, they could not hunt, raid, or fight effectively. Quanah and his people struggled on for a time, but eventually had no choice but to surrender. In 1875, Quanah led his band to Fort Sill in Indian Territory, marking the end of Comanche freedom. What followed was one of the most remarkable personal transformations in American history. Quanah Parker, last chief of the Comanches, adapted to the new order with surprising success. He never forgot his people's traditions, but he recognized that survival required change. On the reservation, he became a leader not through raids, but through diplomacy and adaptation. He befriended white officials, lobbied in Washington, and became a bridge between Comanches and the U.S. government. He built a large house, the Star House, blending Comanche and Victorian styles. He dressed in both Comanche regalia and tailored suits, attended fairs and rodeos, and became something of a celebrity. Quanah also embraced the Native American church and the peyote religion, blending traditional spiritual practices with adaptation to new religious forms. He encouraged his people to adopt some aspects of white life, farming, education, while preserving their identity. Remarkably, this man who had once fought the United States tooth and nail ended up attending Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade and visiting the White House as a respected leader. Gwynne paints Quanah as a tragic but admirable figure. He embodied the violent glory of the Comanche past and the painful compromises of their future. His life was a bridge between two worlds, and though the Comanches lost their empire, Quanah ensured they did not lose their dignity entirely. He lived until 1911, long enough to see his people transformed from free-roaming horsemen to reservation dwellers, and he bore that burden with resilience. The larger story Gwynne tells is of the Comanches' extraordinary rise and inevitable fall. Their rise was fueled by the horse, the buffalo, and the plains themselves, an environment they mastered like no other. Their fall was dictated by forces they could not resist: industrial weapons, relentless settlement, and the destruction of the buffalo. Along the way, they left an indelible mark on American history, shaping the settlement of Texas, the fate of Mexico's northern provinces, and the entire course of the westward expansion. The violence was staggering on both sides. Gwynne does not romanticize the Comanches. Their raids were brutal, their treatment of captives often horrific. Yet he also makes clear the equal or greater brutality of white settlers and soldiers, who pursued extermination through slaughter and starvation. The frontier was not a story of noble settlers versus savage Indians, nor of pure indigenous victims crushed by colonizers. It was a clash of worlds, each with its own logic of survival and violence, played out across a landscape both beautiful and merciless. Empire of the Summer Moon lingers in the reader's mind because it tells not just what happened, but what it felt like. To imagine settlers on the Texas frontier, listening for hoofbeats at night, fearing a Comanche raid that might annihilate their family. To imagine Comanche warriors, galloping across the endless plains, masters of a way of life that seemed eternal but was in fact fleeting. To see the paradox of Cynthia and Parker, who embodied the pull of both cultures but found peace in neither, and of Quanah Parker, who managed to create meaning from the wreckage of his people's world. The legacy of the Comanches is complex. They delayed white expansion for nearly a century, shaped the destiny of nations, and created one of the most remarkable warrior cultures in history. Yet they were also caught in the unstoppable tide of a modernizing America. Their empire of the summer moon, named for the season when raiding was easiest under the full moonlight, was brilliant and terrifying, but ultimately it was ephemeral. When the buffalo vanished and the horse herds were slaughtered, the empire ended. What remained was memory, myth, and the story of a chief who carried his people from the old world into the new. And that's it. S.C.Gwynne's Empire of the Summer Moon. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.